The dust never settled in Dry Hollow. It hung in the air like a curse, coating everything in a fine layer of grit that spoke of hardship and endurance. The town squatted in the middle of nowhere, a collection of weathered buildings that had learned to lean against the constant wind. Saloons outnumbered churches 3-1, and the men who frequented them had faces carved by sun and disappointment. In this unforgiving place, women were expected to be either saints or sinners, with precious little room for anything in between. They kept their heads down, their voices soft, and their dreams buried deeper than the town's dried-up well. Respectability was currency here, and reputation could be spent as quickly as it was earned. At the heart of Dry Hollow's moral landscape stood the white-painted church, its bell tower reaching toward heaven like a desperate prayer. Inside its walls, Pastor Jonathan Whitlow preached salvation to souls that often felt too parched for saving. He was a tall, severe man with graying hair and eyes that seemed to weigh every sin against an invisible scale of judgment. His daughter, Annalise, was considered the town's one true blessing. At 22, she moved through Dry Hollow like a gentle breeze, bringing comfort where there had been only harsh reality. Her golden hair caught the morning light as she carried baskets of food to the sick, her blue eyes soft with compassion as she read stories to the orphaned children at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house. The townspeople called her their angel, crossing themselves when she passed as if her presence alone could ward off the devil that seemed to lurk in every shadow of their harsh existence. Annalise had grown up believing that goodness was her burden to bear. From childhood, her father had impressed upon her the sacred duty of setting an example, of being the light that guided others through their darkness. She distributed medicine to families struck by fever, organized charity drives for struggling widows, and sat beside deathbeds offering final prayers to those who had no one else to hold their hands. "The Lord has blessed you with grace, daughter," Pastor Whitlow would tell her after each act of charity. "It is your responsibility to share that grace with those less fortunate." And so she did, day after day, year after year. She smiled when her heart felt heavy, spoke kindly when she wanted to scream, and maintained her composure when the weight of everyone's expectations threatened to crush her spirit. The people of Dry Hollow saw what they needed to see: a perfect Christian woman, untouched by the corruption that seemed to seep into everything else in their town. But perfection was a cage, and Annalise felt its bars closing in on her with each passing day. She stood now in the church vestry, folding clean linens with mechanical precision while her father discussed parish business with Mayor Vernon Blake in the next room. Their voices carried through the thin walls, and though she tried not to listen, certain words caught her attention like thorns snagging fabric. Financial difficulties, substantial debt, foreclosure. Her hand stilled on the white cotton. The church was in trouble. She had suspected as much from the worried lines that had deepened around her father's eyes in recent months, from the way he counted and recounted the meager offerings each Sunday. "There is, of course, a solution," Mayor Blake's voice continued, smooth as snake oil. "A union between our families would solve both our problems. My position in the community, combined with your moral authority, it would be beneficial for everyone involved." Annalise's blood ran cold. She pressed herself closer to the wall, straining to hear. "Annalise is young," her father said slowly. "And you, forgive me, Vernon, but you are considerably older. I am a man of means and position. I can provide for her in ways that a younger man could not. And think of what this marriage could do for the church. Jonathan, full financial backing, a secure future for your ministry." The words hit Annalise like physical blows. They were discussing her future as if she were a piece of property to be bartered, a solution to a problem rather than a person with her own hopes and dreams. Her hands trembled as she set down the linens and backed away from the wall. She knew Vernon Blake. Everyone in Dry Hollow knew him. He was 53 years old, twice widowed, with thin lips and cold eyes that lingered too long on young women. He owned the general store and half the properties in town, wielding his wealth like a weapon to get what he wanted. The thought of his hands on her, of sharing his bed, of spending her life pretending to love a man who saw her only as a trophy, made her stomach turn. "I'll need to speak with her, of course," her father was saying. "But I believe she understands her duties to our family and to God." Duties. Always duties. Never choices, never desires. Never dreams of her own. That evening, Pastor Whitlow called his daughter into his study. The room smelled of leather and lamp oil, lined with theological texts that seemed to watch her with judgmental eyes. He sat behind his oak desk, his fingers steepled, his expression grave. "Annalise, sit down. We need to discuss your future." She lowered herself into the chair across from him, her spine straight, her hands folded in her lap. The perfect daughter. Even as her world crumbled around her. "The church is facing difficult times," he began. "Our debts have become substantial. Without intervention, we may lose everything, the building, the ministry, our place in this community." She nodded, though her throat felt tight. "I understand, Father. Mayor Blake has made a generous offer. He's willing to assume our debts and ensure the church's future prosperity. In return," he paused, studying her face, "he has asked for your hand in marriage." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a funeral pyre. Annalise felt something inside her chest crack, a sound as quiet as ice breaking on a winter pond. "Father, this is not a matter for discussion. Annalise, this is about sacrifice, about placing the needs of our community above our own desires. Christ himself taught us the value of such sacrifice. But I don't love him." The words escaped before she could stop them, small and desperate. Her father's eyes hardened. "Love is a luxury we cannot afford. Respect, duty, and commitment, these are the foundations of a Christian marriage. Vernon is a good man, a provider, a pillar of our community. He's old enough to be my father. His last wife died of consumption, as did the one before her. Tragedy, not fault." Pastor Whitlow stood, his decision clearly final. "The banns will be read this Sunday. The ceremony will take place in 3 weeks' time. 3 weeks, 21 days of freedom left, and then a lifetime of bondage to a man who saw her as a business transaction." That night, Annalise lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling as moonlight painted silver squares on the wooden floor. Outside, she could hear the wind rattling the shutters, restless and wild. For the first time in her life, she envied that wind, free to go where it pleased, to touch what it chose, to dance with the desert without asking permission. She had spent her entire life being what others needed her to be, the perfect daughter, the perfect Christian, the perfect example for other young women to follow. But what about what she needed? What about her dreams of seeing the world beyond Dry Hollow's dusty streets, of feeling passion instead of duty, of choosing her own path? As dawn broke over the desert, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Annalise made a decision that would change everything. She could not, would not, become Vernon Blake's third wife. She could not spend her life as a sacrifice on the altar of her father's financial problems. She waited until evening, when the church grew quiet and her father retreated to his study for his evening prayers. Then she slipped out of the house, taking nothing but the clothes on her back and the small amount of money she had saved from years of careful penny pinching. The sunset painted the desert in brilliant oranges and purples as she walked, her feet carrying her away from everything she had ever known. She didn't have a destination in mind, only the desperate need to escape the suffocating expectations that had defined her entire existence. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, she found herself at the edge of the Blackthorn Ranch, a place she had heard whispered about in town, where the outcasts and unwanted found work when nowhere else would have them. It was rough country, populated by men with questionable pasts and nothing left to lose. It was also, she realized with a mixture of terror and relief, the last place anyone would think to look for Dry Hollow's fallen angel. The Blackthorn Ranch stretched across the scrubland like a collection of broken promises. Weathered wooden buildings leaned against each other for support, their paint long since stripped away by wind and neglect. This was where Dry Hollow sent its unwanted men who had made mistakes, who carried the weight of their past like stones in their pockets, who worked hard for little pay because they were grateful for any chance at redemption. In the largest of the rundown barns, between stalls that housed horses worth more than their caretakers would ever see, lived Elias Boone. At 28, he had the kind of face that made respectable women cross the street, angular and weathered, with dark hair that fell across eyes the color of storm clouds. A scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, a souvenir from his last night in Tombstone before the sheriff's men had caught up with him. Elias had learned to keep to himself. He rose before dawn, tended to the horses with a gentleness that surprised those who bothered to notice, and spoke only when spoken to. The other ranch hands knew better than to ask about his past, just as he knew better than to ask about theirs. They were all running from something: the law, their mistakes, or simply the weight of living in a world that had no place for broken men. He was brushing down a bay mare when he heard footsteps outside the barn. Soft steps, hesitant and uncertain. Not the heavy boots of the other workers, but something lighter. Elias tensed, his hand moving instinctively toward the knife he kept at his belt. Visitors to Blackthorn Ranch usually meant trouble. The barn door creaked open, and silhouetted against the purple twilight stood a young woman. Even in the dim light, Elias could see the quality of her dress, the careful way she held herself. Townfolk, rich townfolk, by the look of her. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to disturb you. I got lost on my way back to town." Elias stepped out of the shadows, and the woman gasped, taking a quick step backward. He was used to that reaction. His face wasn't one that inspired confidence, especially not in ladies who lived sheltered lives behind white picket fences. "You're a long way from anywhere respectable, miss," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "Blackthorn ain't the kind of place a lady should find herself, lost or otherwise." She lifted her chin with a pride that seemed at odds with her trembling hands. "I'm not afraid of you." Maybe you should be. But even as he said it, Elias found himself studying her more carefully. There was something wrong with this picture. A well-dressed woman, alone at sunset, claiming to be lost near the most notorious ranch in the county. Her blonde hair was coming loose from its pins. Her blue dress was dusty from travel, and there was something in her eyes that spoke of desperation rather than mere confusion. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated. Anna Smith." A lie. He could hear it in the way she stumbled over the common surname. But then, he was hardly one to judge others for reinventing themselves. "Well, Miss Smith, you picked a hell of a place to get lost. Town's a good 5 miles back the way you came, and it'll be full dark soon. Desert ain't kind to folks caught out after sundown." She wrapped her arms around herself, and Elias noticed the way she shivered despite the evening's warmth. This wasn't about being lost. This was about running. I don't have anywhere else to go," she admitted, her voice breaking slightly. The admission hung between them like a confession. Elias recognized the sound of it, the same desperate honesty he'd heard in his own voice years ago when he'd begged the sheriff for just one more chance. Just one more day before they locked him away. Against his better judgment, he found himself saying, "Come on inside. We've got some stew left from supper. You can rest up before you head back to wherever it is you're really going." She followed him deeper into the barn, past the horses that nickered softly at their approach. Elias had made himself a small living space in the back corner, a cot, a wooden crate that served as a table, and a small stove that threw off just enough heat to keep the desert cold at bay. It wasn't much, but it was his. He ladled some of the thin beef stew into a tin bowl and handed it to her along with a bent spoon. She accepted it gratefully, though he noticed how her hands shook as she lifted the spoon to her lips. "You want to tell me what you're really running from?" he asked, settling onto a hay bale across from her makeshift seat on his cot. She looked up at him, and in the lamplight he could see tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "What makes you think I'm running?" "Takes one to know one, I suppose." They ate in silence for a while. The only sounds the soft shuffling of horses and the distant coyote calls that echoed across the desert. Elias found himself stealing glances at her, trying to reconcile the refined way she held herself with the raw fear he could sense beneath her composed exterior. "They call you the town angel," he said suddenly, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. Her spoon clattered against the bowl. "You know who I am. Annalise Whitlow, pastor's daughter. Every man in 3 counties knows who you are, even us disreputable types." He leaned back, studying her with new interest. "Question is, what's the town angel doing in a place like this, lying about her name?" The tears came then, silent streams down her cheeks that she made no attempt to hide. "They want to marry me off to Mayor Blake. 3 weeks from now, my father says it's my duty, that I have to sacrifice for the church." Elias had seen Vernon Blake around town, a soft man with hard eyes and wandering hands, the kind who took what he wanted and justified it later. The thought of this gentle creature bound to such a man made something dark and protective stir in his chest. "So you ran. I can't." She struggled with the words. "Have you ever loved someone you were afraid to tell?" The question caught him off guard. He thought of Sarah, the banker's daughter who had promised to wait for him, who had smiled and kissed him goodbye the night before his arrest, who had married his best friend 2 months later while he rotted in a cell, counting days like a prayer. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I have." Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition of shared pain that made the space around them feel smaller and more intimate. Annalise set down her bowl and really looked at him for the first time, not at the scar or the rough clothes or the reputation that preceded him, but at the man underneath. "You're not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "A monster, I suppose. The way people talk about this place, about the men who work here." Elias laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Maybe they're right. Maybe you should be afraid. I told you before, I'm not afraid of you. Then you're braver than most." She stood then, moving closer to where he sat on the hay bale. In the lamplight, she looked ethereal, otherworldly, everything the people of Dry Hollow claimed she was. But her eyes held a very human sadness, a longing that matched his own. "I don't want to be brave," she whispered. "I'm tired of being what everyone else needs me to be." Without thinking, Elias reached up and touched her face, his calloused thumb brushing away a tear. She leaned into the contact, her eyes closing as if she were savoring the simple human connection. "You don't have to be anything here," he said. "Just yourself." When she opened her eyes and looked at him, he saw something in them that took his breath away, not the perfect purity that the town worshipped, but real desire, real need. She was tired of being untouchable, tired of being placed on a pedestal where no one could reach her. "I don't even know who that is anymore," she confessed. "Then maybe it's time to find out." The space between them disappeared as she leaned down and he stood up, meeting her halfway. When their lips touched, it was tentative at first, almost questioning, but then she made a small sound in the back of her throat and pressed closer, her hands fisting in his shirt as if she were afraid he might disappear. The kiss tasted like salt from her tears, and something sweeter, hope, maybe, or the promise of something neither of them had dared name. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, staring at each other in wonder and shock at their own boldness. "I should go," she whispered, but she didn't move away. "Probably," he agreed, his hands still resting on her waist. Instead, she kissed him again, and this time there was nothing hesitant about it. This time it was hungry and desperate. The kiss of 2 people who had been drowning in loneliness and had finally found someone who understood. When they finally separated, the lamp had burned low, and the night sounds of the desert seemed louder, more immediate. Annalise pressed her forehead against his, her breath warm against his skin. "What happens now?" she asked. Elias wished he had an answer. He knew this couldn't last. She was a preacher's daughter, destined for marriage to a respectable man, while he was an ex-convict with nothing to offer but his labor and his damaged heart. But for this moment, With her in his arms and the rest of the world held at bay by shadows and lamplight, he allowed himself to hope. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But whatever happens, you're not alone anymore." Outside, a horse whinnied softly, and somewhere in the distance, a night bird called its lonely song to the stars. But inside the barn, surrounded by the scent of hay and horses and the woman who had stumbled into his life like an answered prayer, Elias Boone felt something he hadn't experienced in years. He felt like he might be worth saving after all. The walk back to town felt like a funeral march. Each step carried Annalise further from the warmth she had found in Elias's arms and closer to the suffocating reality of her prescribed life. The taste of his kiss still lingered on her lips, a secret sweetness she carried like a prayer against her heart. Dawn was breaking over Dry Hollow as she slipped through the back door of the parsonage, her shoes in her hand to muffle her footsteps. She had hoped to reach her room undetected, but her father's voice stopped her cold on the narrow staircase. "Annalise." Pastor Jonathan Whitlow stood in the doorway of his study, still dressed in yesterday's clothes, his hair disheveled and his eyes red-rimmed with worry and sleeplessness. She had never seen him look so human, so vulnerable, and for a moment her heart ached with something that might have been guilt. "Father, Where were you?" His voice was quiet, controlled, but she could hear the storm brewing beneath the calm surface. "I needed air. I couldn't sleep, so I went for a walk." The lie came easier than she had expected, sliding off her tongue like silk. He studied her face in the pale morning light, taking in her disheveled appearance, the dust on her dress, the way she couldn't quite meet his eyes. "A walk that lasted all night?" I lost track of time. I was praying about the marriage, about my duties. Something flickered across his features. Relief, perhaps, or hope that his daughter was coming to terms with her fate. "And what did the Lord tell you?" The question hung between them like a trap. Annalise thought of Elias's hands on her face, of the way he had looked at her not as a symbol or an example, but as a woman. She thought of the freedom she had tasted in his kiss, brief as summer lightning. "That I must trust in his plan?" she said, the words ash in her mouth. Pastor Whitlow's shoulders sagged with relief. "Good, good. Vernon will be pleased to hear that you found peace with the arrangement." He moved closer, placing a heavy hand on her shoulder. "You're doing the right thing, daughter, sacrificing for the greater good, just as Christ did for us all." Sacrifice. The word followed her up the stairs and into her small room, where she finally allowed herself to break. She pressed her face into her pillow to muffle her sobs, tasting salt and remembering the way Elias had brushed her tears away with such tenderness. How could she return to this life of careful smiles and measured words when she had glimpsed what it felt like to be truly alive? The days that followed passed in a blur of wedding preparations and false enthusiasm from the townspeople. Mrs. Henderson brought fabric samples for her wedding dress, chattering excitedly about what a lovely bride she would make. The other women of the congregation offered advice about managing a household, their eyes bright with vicarious excitement. "Vernon Blake is such a catch." "Mrs." Carmichael gushed as they arranged flowers for Sunday service. "You're so fortunate, dear. Not every girl gets the chance to marry so well." Annalise smiled and nodded and played her part, but inside she felt like she was dying by degrees. Her father watched her constantly now, suspicious of her sudden compliance. He had forbidden her from leaving the house alone, claiming it was for her own protection until the wedding. "A young woman's reputation is fragile," he explained. "We cannot be too careful in these final weeks." So she became a prisoner in her own home, counting the hours until her sentence would be carried out. But as the sun began its descent toward the horizon each evening, a familiar restlessness would take hold of her. She would find excuses to step onto the back porch, to breathe the desert air and look toward the distant outline of the Blackthorn Ranch. On the fourth evening of her captivity, she could stand it no longer. She waited until her father retreated to his study for his evening prayers, then slipped out through the kitchen door. The dying light painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson as she made her way along the familiar path, her heart beating faster with each step. Elias was waiting for her in the barn, as if he had known she would come. He looked up from the bridle he was mending, and the smile that spread across his scarred face was worth every risk she had taken to be there. "I wasn't sure you'd come back," he said, setting aside his work. "I wasn't sure either." She moved closer, drawn by the warmth in his storm-gray eyes. "But I couldn't stay away." This time there was no hesitation when he reached for her. His arms closed around her like a benediction, and she buried her face against his chest, breathing in the scent of leather and hay, and something indefinably masculine that made her pulse quicken. "I can't stop thinking about you," she whispered against his shirt. "Good," he murmured into her hair, "because you're driving me half crazy too." They talked that night, really talked, sharing pieces of themselves they had never given to anyone else. Elias told her about his childhood on a failing farm, about the desperation that had driven him to make the choices that landed him in prison, about the woman who had promised to wait for him, and the betrayal that had taught him not to trust his heart to anyone. "Until now," he said, his fingers tracing patterns on her hand as they sat side by side on a bale of hay. Annalise told him about the suffocating weight of everyone's expectations, about feeling like she was slowly disappearing beneath the layers of who everyone needed her to be, about the dreams she had never dared voice, to see the ocean, to read books that weren't approved by her father, to make choices based on her own desires rather than duty. "I've never told anyone these things," she said as they walked together in the moonlight behind the barn, careful to stay in the shadows. "Maybe that's because you never found anyone worth telling." When he kissed her that night, it was different from their first desperate embrace. This was slower, deeper, a claiming that made her feel like she was finally coming home to herself. His hands were gentle as they tangled in her hair, and when she pressed closer, wanting more of his warmth, more of the connection that made her feel whole, he didn't pull away. "Annalise?" He breathed against her lips, and her name on his tongue sounded like a prayer. They found a place to be together away from prying eyes, an old line shack at the edge of the ranch property where the desert met the scrubland. It was their sanctuary, their secret world where the rules of Dry Hollow couldn't reach them. Night after night, she slipped away to meet him there. They would sit by lamplight sharing stories and dreams, and then lose themselves in each other's arms as the desert wind sang through the gaps in the weathered wood. He was patient with her innocence, gentle with her fears, showing her what it meant to be cherished rather than simply protected. "You're beautiful," he would whisper as his hands mapped the curves of her body. And for the first time in her life, she felt beautiful rather than merely pure. Their lovemaking was a revelation, tender and passionate by turns. A conversation conducted in sighs and whispered endearments. In his arms, she discovered parts of herself she had never known existed. A woman capable of desire and boldness that would have scandalized the good people of Dry Hollow. One night, as they lay entwined on the narrow cot he had brought to their hideaway, she traced the scars that mapped his chest like a geography of pain. "Tell me about these," she said softly. His hand covered hers, stilling her exploration. "Some stories are better left buried. Not for me. I want to know all of you, the scars and the healing both." So he told her about the fight that had landed him in prison, about defending a saloon girl from a man with too much money and no conscience, about the beating he had taken from the guards, about the years of hard labor that had carved the strength into his shoulders and the wariness into his eyes. "I'm not a good man, Annalise," he said when he finished. "I've done things, made choices that can't be undone." She kissed each scar as if she could heal them with her lips. "You're good enough for me. You deserve better. You deserve someone who can give you a real life, not stolen moments in the dark." She raised herself up to look at him, her hair falling like a curtain around them. "Don't tell me what I deserve. Let me choose for myself, for once in my life." The vulnerability in her voice broke something open in his chest. This brave, beautiful woman who had risked everything just to feel alive. She deserved the world, and all he could offer her was his damaged heart and a love that society would never accept. But when she kissed him again, fierce and claiming, he stopped thinking about what was impossible and lost himself in what was real. Their love might be forbidden, their future uncertain, but in that moment they had each other, and it felt like enough. "I need you to keep me," she whispered against his lips one night as the stars wheeled overhead. "Whatever it costs, whatever happens, I need you to keep me. Always," he promised, sealing the vow with a kiss that tasted of forever. But even as they held each other in the darkness, both knew that dawn was coming, and with it the reckoning that would test whether love was truly stronger than the forces that sought to tear them apart. In 2 weeks, she would become Vernon Blake's wife, unless something changed. The thought hung between them unspoken, a shadow that grew longer with each passing night. Neither of them imagined that the choice would be taken from them so soon, or that their secret would be exposed by the very man who had shown her what it meant to be free. The betrayal came from the most unlikely source. Tommy McReady was barely 18, a scrawny kid with nervous eyes who had been working at the Blackthorn Ranch for only 3 months. He'd been caught stealing horses in Tucson and had fled north with a posse on his tail. The ranch had taken him in as they took in all the desperate ones, asking no questions as long as he pulled his weight. But Tommy was young and scared. And when Sheriff Morrison showed up at the ranch asking questions about rustled cattle, the boy's nerve broke like a twig in a storm. "I ain't done nothing wrong lately, Sheriff," Tommy stammered, sweat beading on his pale forehead despite the morning chill. "Been working hard, keeping my nose clean." Sheriff Morrison was a weathered man with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. He'd been keeping the peace in this corner of the territory for 15 years, and he could smell guilt like smoke on the wind. "That so?" Morrison drawled, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "Then you won't mind telling me why the preacher's daughter has been seen walking out here after dark?" The other ranch hands went still. Even the horses seemed to sense the sudden tension that crackled through the air like lightning before a storm. Tommy's eyes darted toward the barn where Elias was working, then back to the sheriff. I don't know nothing about that. Funny thing about lies, boy. They have a way of eating at a man from the inside." Morrison stepped closer, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "Now, I'm going to ask you one more time. What do you know about Miss Whitlow's nighttime visits?" The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Tommy looked around desperately at the faces of the other men, searching for guidance or support and finding only cold indifference. These men had learned long ago not to stick their necks out for anyone. She comes sometimes," Tommy whispered, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Real late, when most folks are sleeping. I seen her heading toward the old line shack with Boone." The admission hit the morning air like a gunshot. Inside the barn, Elias straightened from his work, every muscle in his body going taut as he heard the betrayal unfold outside. Within an hour, the story had spread through Dry Hollow like wildfire in summer grass. The preacher's daughter, their angel, had been carrying on with an ex-convict at the most notorious ranch in the county. The scandal was too delicious to keep quiet, too shocking to believe yet impossible to dismiss. Pastor Jonathan Whitlow heard the news from Mrs. Henderson, who delivered it with the breathless excitement of someone who had never been the bearer of such momentous gossip. "Jonathan, I hate to be the one to tell you this, but people are talking about Annalise, about where she's been spending her evenings." The pastor's face went white as church paint. "What are you saying, Helen?" "They're saying she's been intimate with that Boone fellow, the one with the scar, who went to prison for fighting." "Oh, Jonathan, I'm sure it's just malicious gossip, but people are talking, and you know how these things spread." The words hit him like physical blows. His daughter, his pure, perfect daughter, consorting with a criminal, defiling herself with a man barely fit to clean the church floors. It was impossible. It was unthinkable. It was, he realized with growing horror, entirely believable. He confronted Annalise in her room, his face terrible with righteous fury and paternal betrayal. She was sitting by her window, gazing toward the distant ranch with the dreamy expression he now recognized as longing rather than piety. "Is it true?" he demanded without preamble. She turned to face him, and he saw the truth written in her eyes before she spoke a word. The guilt, the defiance, the fierce protectiveness that flared when she realized their secret was exposed. "Father, is it true?" he roared, his control finally snapping. "Have you been sneaking out to that den of iniquity? Have you been lying with that animal?" Annalise stood slowly, her chin lifting in a gesture of pride that reminded him painfully of her mother. "His name is Elias. And yes, I've been seeing him." The confirmation staggered him. He had hoped, prayed, that it was all malicious rumor, that his daughter was still the pure angel he had raised her to be. But here she stood, admitting her sin without shame, her eyes bright with something that looked disturbingly like happiness. "You have disgraced yourself," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "You have disgraced our family, our church, everything I have worked to build in this community." "I've found something real," she replied, her voice steady despite the tears beginning to track down her cheeks. "For the first time in my life, I've found something that's mine." "You have found damnation." He struck her then, his palm connecting with her cheek in a sharp crack that echoed through the small room. It was the first time he had ever raised a hand to her, and the shock of it froze them both. Within the hour, half the town had gathered in the main street, drawn by the news like vultures to carrion. Mayor Blake stood on the steps of his store, his face thunderous with humiliation and rage. The woman he had intended to make his wife, his pure, respectable wife, had been rolling in the hay with an ex-convict like a common saloon girl. Sheriff Morrison had already ridden out to the ranch with a posse of townsmen. They dragged Elias from the barn where he was working, his hands bound with rope, his face already bearing the marks of their rough justice. "Elias Boone," Morrison announced as they hauled him into the center of town. "You stand accused of corrupting a Christian woman and defiling the daughter of a man of God." The crowd pressed closer, their face hungry for violence and vindication. These were good, God-fearing people who had precious little excitement in their hard lives, and the spectacle of a fallen angel and her devil lover was better than Christmas and the 4th of July combined. They threw Elias to his knees in the dust, and Mayor Blake stepped forward with a horsewhip in his hand. "This is what happens to men who don't know their place," he snarled. "Who think they can take what belongs to their betters?" The first lash opened a line of fire across Elias's back, but he didn't cry out. He had endured worse in prison, and his pride wouldn't allow him to give these hypocrites the satisfaction of hearing him scream. Pastor Whitlow emerged from the parsonage, dragging his daughter behind him. Annalise's face was pale but determined, her jaw set in the stubborn line that had worried him as a child and terrified him now. "Kneel," he commanded, forcing her down beside the whipping post. "Ask forgiveness from this community for your shameful behavior." The crowd waited with bated breath, eager to see their fallen angel brought low. But Annalise looked up at her father, then at the faces surrounding her, faces she had served and comforted and blessed for years, and something inside her crystallized into unbreakable resolve. She rose to her feet, brushing the dust from her skirts with deliberate dignity. "I will not kneel," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the stunned silence. "And I will not apologize for loving someone who treats me like a human being instead of a symbol." The gasp that went up from the crowd was audible. This was not how the scene was supposed to play out. The fallen woman was supposed to repent, to grovel for forgiveness, to provide them with a satisfying conclusion to their moral outrage. Mayor Blake raised the whip again, this time aiming for Elias's face. But before he could strike, Elias lifted his head and looked directly at the crowd, his storm-gray eyes blazing with fierce pride. "You want the truth?" he called out, his voice raw but strong. "She wasn't the pure little lamb you all pretended she was. She came to me first, begging for what you all were too afraid to give her. She was the one who reached for me in the dark, who showed me what it meant to be wanted by a woman who knew her own mind." The words hit the crowd like a physical blow. The image of their angel as the seducer rather than the seduced was more shocking than any sin they had imagined. She was fire in my arms, Elias continued, his words carrying the ring of absolute truth. Real and hungry and alive, not the cold statue you made her into, and if loving her is a sin, then I'll burn for it gladly. Annalise felt tears streaming down her face. But they weren't tears of shame. They were tears of gratitude for this man who was willing to destroy himself to give her the gift of truth, the truth about who she really was beneath all their expectations. She stepped forward, placing herself between Elias and the raised whip. "If you want to punish someone, punish me," she said. "I chose this, I chose him, and I choose him still." Pastor Whitlow looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and saw a stranger. This wasn't the obedient child he had raised, the perfect example of Christian womanhood he had molded. This was a woman who had found her own voice and was prepared to use it, regardless of the consequences. "Then you are no daughter of mine," he said, his voice breaking with grief and rage. "Get out. Get out of my house, out of my church, out of my sight. You are dead to me." The words were like a physical blow, but Annalise didn't flinch. She had known this moment would come from the first night she had walked into that barn. She had chosen love over safety, passion over respectability, and now she would pay the price. "So be it," she said quietly. The crowd watched in stunned silence as she walked to where Elias knelt in the dust, his back bloody but his head still high. She knelt beside him and took his bound hands in hers, her touch gentle on his torn skin. "I told you to keep me," she whispered, "whatever it cost." He looked at her through the blood and sweat, and despite everything, he smiled. Even now, especially now. Sheriff Morrison looked around at the shocked faces of the townspeople, then at the young couple kneeling together in the dust. Whatever he had expected from this day's work, it wasn't this display of defiant love in the face of total ruin. "You've got 1 hour to get your things and get out of town," he said quietly. "Both of you. After that, I can't guarantee your safety." Mayor Blake started to protest, but Morrison cut him off with a sharp gesture. "They're leaving. Vernon, that's what you wanted, isn't it? The problem solved?" As the crowd began to disperse, muttering among themselves about the shocking turn of events, Annalise helped Elias to his feet. His shirt was in tatters, his back a map of wounds, but he stood straight and proud beside her. They had lost everything: home, family, community, respectability. But as they walked away from the town square together, hand in hand, neither looked back. They had each other, and for now, that would have to be enough. They had nothing but the clothes on their backs and each other. The Blackthorn Ranch had been torched that very night, angry townsmen taking their frustration out on the buildings that had harbored their fallen angels' corruption. Elias watched the orange glow paint the distant sky as they walked away from everything they had ever known, his jaw tight with suppressed rage at the senseless destruction. "I'm sorry," Annalise whispered as they picked their way along the rocky trail in the moonlight. "This is all my fault. If I hadn't been so selfish, so reckless—" "Don't." His voice was rough with exhaustion and pain, but firm. "Don't you dare apologize for choosing to live." They walked through the night, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and Dry Hollow. Elias's back was a symphony of agony with each step, the wounds from Blake's whip still seeping blood through his torn shirt. But he pushed forward, driven by the knowledge that stopping meant death, either from exposure or from the lynch mob that might still come after them. As dawn broke over the desert, they found shelter in a shallow cave carved into a red rock outcropping. It wasn't much, barely deep enough to protect them from the elements, but it was hidden from the main trail, and, for now, that was enough. Annalise tore strips from her petticoat to clean and bind Elias's wounds, her hands gentle but sure as she worked. She had tended the sick and injured countless times in Dry Hollow, but never had the work felt so personal, so desperate. "Hold still," she murmured as he winced under her ministrations. "I know it hurts. I've had worse." But his voice was strained, and she could see the lines of pain etched around his eyes. "From the prison guards?" He nodded. then caught her hand as she reached for another bandage. "Annalise, you need to understand what you've done, what we've both done. There's no going back from this. No forgiveness, no redemption in the eyes of decent folk. You'll never be able to return to that life." She looked at him steadily, her blue eyes clear and determined despite the tears that had dried on her cheeks. "Good. I never want to see that life again. I never want to be that person again, the perfect little doll they dressed up and put on display. But this," he gestured at their meager shelter, at the vast emptiness stretching in all directions. "This isn't what you were raised for. You don't know what it's like to be hungry, to be cold, to have nowhere to go and no one to turn to. Then teach me." She finished binding his wounds and sat back on her heels. "Teach me how to survive. Teach me how to be free." The first weeks were the hardest thing either of them had ever endured. The desert in late autumn was unforgiving, scorching hot during the day, bone-chillingly cold at night. They had no supplies, no weapons except the knife Elias carried, no food but what they could forage or catch. Elias taught her to identify edible plants, to set snares for rabbits, to find water in the most unlikely places. His hands, scarred from years of hard labor, showed her how to make fire without matches, how to fashion tools from stones and sticks, how to read the signs that meant shelter or danger. She learned to ignore the constant gnawing of hunger, to push through exhaustion when they had to keep moving, to sleep on rocky ground without complaint. Her soft hands grew calloused, her pale skin darkened by sun and wind. Her fine dress became tattered and stained beyond recognition. But she also learned other things. The fierce joy of watching a sunset with no one to tell her it was time for evening prayers. The freedom of speaking her mind without measuring every word against propriety. The deep satisfaction of contributing to their survival through her own efforts rather than charity work that kept her safely distant from real hardship. Most of all, she learned what it meant to be loved not for what she represented, but for who she was. They found a more permanent shelter as winter approached, a small cave system deeper in the mountains, with a natural spring and enough space for a proper camp. Elias worked tirelessly to make it habitable, building a fire pit with stones, constructing crude furniture from fallen logs, fashioning tools they would need to survive the harsh months ahead. Annalise watched him work, marveling at his skill and determination. This man who had been dismissed as a worthless criminal was revealing himself to be capable, intelligent, resourceful in ways that put her own sheltered education to shame. "Where did you learn all this?" she asked one evening as they sat by their fire, sharing the rabbit he had snared that morning. "Prison teaches you a lot about making do with nothing," he said simply. "And before that, well, growing up poor on a failing farm, you learn to be creative or you don't eat." She studied his face in the firelight, seeing past the scar to the strength beneath. "Tell me about before, about your family." He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, slowly, the story emerged. Parents who died young, leaving him to care for younger siblings on land that wouldn't grow enough to feed them. The desperate choices that led him into trouble, the fight that sent him to prison, the years of hardship that had carved him into the man he was now. "I never thought I'd have anything good in my life," he said finally. "Never thought I deserved it." "And now?" she asked softly. He reached across the space between them and touched her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. "Now I have you, and I'm going to spend every day of the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that gift." She leaned into his touch, her heart full despite their circumstances. "You already are." That night, as the wind howled through the mountains and snow began to dust the rocks around their shelter, they came together with a desperate tenderness that spoke of more than physical need. They were two souls who had lost everything except each other, finding warmth and comfort and hope in the joining of their bodies. "I love you," she whispered against his throat as he moved over her, his hands reverent on her skin despite the roughness of their surroundings. "I love you too," he breathed back. "More than my own life. More than anything I ever thought possible." The words were a vow. a promise that bound them more surely than any ceremony could have done. They were husband and wife in all the ways that mattered, united by choice and hardship and a love that had survived the loss of everything else. Winter was brutal. They huddled together for warmth as snow piled deep outside their cave, surviving on stored supplies and the occasional successful hunt. There were days when they spoke little, conserving energy for the simple business of staying alive. There were nights when they held each other and wondered if they would see another spring. But there were also moments of unexpected beauty, mornings when the snow-covered landscape glittered like diamonds in the early light, evenings when they sat by the fire and she read to him from the one book she had managed to save, her voice soft and musical in the close confines of their shelter. "What's that one about?" he asked one night after she had finished a particularly moving passage. "A woman who defies her family to marry the man she loves," she said with a small smile. "It doesn't end well for them. Good thing we're writing our own story then." She looked at him across the fire, this man who had risked everything for her, who had chosen exile and hardship over the safety of letting her go. "What do you think our ending will be?" "Whatever we make it," he said firmly. "We're not characters in someone else's tale anymore. Annalise, we're free to choose." One particularly bitter night, as they lay wrapped in their shared blankets with the wind screaming outside, she traced the scars on his chest with gentle fingers. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Leaving everything behind for this?" He was quiet for a moment, his arms tightening around her. "I regret that you had to leave everything behind. I regret that loving me cost you your family, your home, your place in the world. But regret us? Never. Even if we die out here? Especially if we die out here." He tilted her chin up so he could look into her eyes. "I'd rather have 1 year of real life with you than a lifetime of the existence I had before. If tomorrow is my last day, I'll still count myself the luckiest man who ever lived." Tears slipped down her cheeks, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of gratitude for this love that had transformed her from a beautiful ornament into a living, breathing woman. "If I had to do it all again," she whispered, "I would choose you. Every time. In every life. I would choose you." They sealed the vow with a kiss that tasted of snow and wood smoke and the promise of spring. Outside, the wind continued its lonely song, but inside their shelter, wrapped in each other's arms, they were warm and safe and completely, utterly free. When spring finally came, melting the snow and bringing green back to the world, they emerged from their winter sanctuary changed. Harder, perhaps, but also stronger. They had survived their first test as a couple, proven that their love could endure not just scandal and exile, but the harsh realities of life on the margins. As they prepared to leave their mountain refuge and venture back into the world, Annalise looked back one last time at the cave that had been their home, their sanctuary, their refuge from a world that had rejected them. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" Elias asked, shouldering their meager pack of supplies. "For teaching me that home isn't a place," she said, taking his offered hand. "It's a person." Together, they walked down from the mountains and into an uncertain but hopeful future, two hearts beating as one, ready to face whatever came next as long as they faced it together. They found Vernon Blake waiting for them at their spring camp. Elias and Annalise had descended from the high country as the snow melted, following game trails down to a sheltered valley where wildflowers painted the meadows in brilliant yellows and purples. They had been living there for 2 weeks, rebuilding their strength after the harsh winter, when Blake emerged from the tree line like a specter from their past. He wasn't alone. 3 men flanked him, hard-faced drifters with guns on their hips and cruelty in their eyes, the kind of men who asked no questions as long as the pay was good and the work kept them on the right side of the law. Technically speaking. Well, Blake said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a hunter who had finally cornered his prey, the runaway bride and her pet convict. Elias stepped protectively in front of Annalise, his hand moving instinctively to the knife at his belt. It was a pitiful weapon against 4 armed men, but it was all he had. "Blake," The name came out like a curse. "What do you want?" The mayor's smile was cold as winter wind. "What's mine? Of course, a debt unpaid, you might say." His pale eyes fixed on Annalise, who stood straight and defiant despite the fear he could see flickering in her gaze. "You cost me a considerable sum, my dear. The dowry I paid your father, the wedding preparations, the humiliation in front of the entire territory. That kind of damage doesn't come free." "I never agreed to marry you," Annalise said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Any arrangement was between you and my father." "Ah, but you see, that's where you're wrong." Blake pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. "A signed contract, promising you in marriage in exchange for the church's debts. Your father's signature, legally binding. Which means, technically, you belong to me." Elias's grip tightened on his knife. "That paper isn't worth the ink it's written with. She's a free woman." "Free?" Blake laughed, the sound sharp as breaking glass. "She's a fallen woman, living in sin with an ex-convict. No court in the territory would side with her against a respectable businessman like myself." He gestured to his hired men. "Take her." The three gunmen started forward, but Elias was already moving. Years of hard labor had built strength into his shoulders, and desperation lent him speed. He crashed into the first man with the force of an avalanche, sending them both tumbling into the dirt. "Run!" he shouted to Annalise as he grappled with his opponent. "Get to the rocks!" But she didn't run. Instead, she grabbed the rifle they kept for hunting, the one weapon they had managed to acquire through trade with a traveling merchant, and leveled it at Blake's chest with hands that barely shook. "Call them off," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had finally found her backbone. "Call them off, or I'll shoot you where you stand." Blake's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. My, the preacher's daughter with a gun. How far you've fallen. Annalise, your poor father would be heartbroken to see what you've become." "My father made his choice when he sold me like cattle," she replied, the rifle never wavering. "Now I'm making mine." The fight between Elias and the gunman had devolved into a brutal wrestling match in the dirt. Elias was stronger, but the other man had the advantage of being well fed through the winter. They rolled and struck and clawed, neither able to gain a decisive advantage. The second gunman raised his pistol to end the fight with a bullet, but Annalise swung the rifle toward him. The shot echoed across the valley like thunder, and the man stumbled backward, clutching his shoulder as blood seeped between his fingers. "Next one goes in your heart," she warned, working the rifle's action with practiced efficiency. Months of hunting for survival had made her competent with the weapon, though she had never imagined using it against human targets. Blake's face darkened with rage. "You little—" His words were cut off as Elias finally gained the upper hand, his knife finding the soft flesh beneath his opponent's ribs. The man gasped and went still, his eyes wide with surprise at this sudden ending to his story. The third gunman, seeing his companion dead and the second wounded, suddenly lost his appetite for violence. "This ain't worth it, Blake," he muttered, backing toward the trees. "You didn't pay us enough to die for your wounded pride." He melted into the forest like smoke, leaving Blake alone with his wounded associate and a couple who had proven far more dangerous than anticipated. "It's over, Blake," Elias said, rising from beside the dead man, his knife still red with blood. "Take your friend and go. Don't come back." But Blake's eyes held the fanatical gleam of a man who had lost too much to simply walk away. "You think this ends here? You think you can just disappear into the wilderness and live happily ever after?" He laughed bitterly. "I'll follow you to the ends of the earth if I have to. She belongs to me. I belong to myself," Annalise said firmly, the rifle still trained on his chest. "And I choose him." "Then you've chosen death," Blake snarled. "Both of you. If I can't have you, no one can." He went for his gun then, his hand moving with surprising speed for a soft town politician. But Annalise was faster. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and Blake staggered backward, his eyes wide with shock as he looked down at the spreading red stain on his vest. "You shot me," he whispered, as if he couldn't quite believe it. "You actually shot me?" "Yes," she said simply. "I did." Blake fell to his knees, then pitched forward onto his face. The wounded gunman took one look at his employer's still form and limped away into the trees as quickly as his injury would allow, wanting no part of whatever reckoning might follow. Silence settled over the valley like a blanket. Annalise lowered the rifle with shaking hands, staring at what she had done. A year ago, she had been the town angel, dispensing charity and comfort to the needy. Now she was a killer, standing over the body of a man she had shot in cold blood. "I killed him," she whispered, her voice small and lost. Elias crossed to her side and gently took the rifle from her nerveless fingers. "You defended yourself, defended us. That's not murder, that's survival. Is that what we've become? Killers hiding in the wilderness?" He turned her to face him, his hands firm on her shoulders. "We've become what we had to become to stay alive and stay together. Blake would never have stopped hunting us. Never. This way. It's finished." She looked into his eyes and saw the truth there. They had crossed another line today, stepped further away from the civilized world that had rejected them. But they had also freed themselves from the last chain that bound them to their old lives. News of Blake's death traveled fast through the sparse settlements of the territory. Some called it justice, the corrupt politician finally meeting his end at the hands of those he had wronged. Others whispered of murder and lawlessness, of what happened when decent folks strayed too far from God's path. But surprisingly, a different story began to emerge as well. Word spread that the church in Dry Hollow had been built on blood money, that Pastor Whitlow had sold his own daughter to pay debts incurred through his own poor judgment. Some of the congregation began to question their beloved preacher, wondering what other compromises he had made in the name of respectability. Mrs. Henderson, the boarding house keeper who had known Annalise since childhood, was the first to speak up. "That girl was nothing but kindness her whole life," she told anyone who would listen. "If she ran off with that man, it was because she saw something in him worth saving. And if Vernon Blake is dead, well, perhaps the Lord works in mysterious ways." Others began to remember things they had chosen to forget. Blake's wandering hands at church socials, his treatment of employees who couldn't fight back, his habit of calling in debts when it suited his purposes and forgiving them when it served his political ambitions. Slowly, grudgingly, some in Dry Hollow began to wonder if they had driven out an angel to protect a devil. But by then, Elias and Annalise were long gone, having abandoned their valley camp the same day as the shooting. They traveled light and fast, putting distance between themselves and the scene of Blake's death, knowing that lawmen would come looking eventually, regardless of the justification. They made their way west, toward the territories where a law was scarcer and questions were fewer, where a man and woman could start over with new names and a clean slate, if they were brave enough to seize the chance. As they rode away from everything they had ever known, Annalise looked back one last time toward the distant mountains that had sheltered them through their first winter of freedom. "Any regrets?" Elias asked, following her gaze. She thought about it seriously, about the woman she had been, the life she had left behind, the blood on her hands, and the uncertain future ahead. "No," she said finally. "No regrets." They rode on together into the setting sun, two souls bound by love and hardship, and the knowledge that they had chosen each other over everything else the world had to offer. Behind them lay death and scandal and the ashes of their former lives. Ahead lay possibility. 6 months of hard travel brought them to Redemption Creek, a small town perched on the edge of civilization where the Colorado River carved its way through red rock canyons. It was the kind of place where people came to disappear, to start over, to leave their past buried in the dust of distant roads. The town had earned its name honestly. Most of its residents were seeking some form of redemption, whether from the law, from their mistakes, or from themselves. The sheriff was a former outlaw who had found religion. The school teacher had been a saloon girl in Kansas City before deciding she wanted a different life. The doctor had lost his license back east for drinking, but had proved his skills were still sound when it mattered. Nobody asked too many questions in Redemption Creek, and that suited Elias and Annalise perfectly. They had spent their last coins on basic supplies in the previous town, arriving with nothing but their horses, their few possessions, and a determination to build something real from the ashes of their former lives. Elias had introduced them as Mr. and Mrs. Samuel Brooks, married in a simple ceremony before a circuit preacher whose name they couldn't quite recall. The lie came easily now. They had practiced it during their long journey, creating a history that would satisfy curious neighbors without inviting too much scrutiny. They were farmers from Kansas, looking for new opportunities in the territories. She had been a teacher before their marriage. He had worked his family's land until drought drove them west. The blacksmith shop sat empty at the edge of town, its previous owner having died of fever the winter before. The building was solid stone and timber, with living quarters upstairs and the forge still in working condition. The town council was happy to rent it to someone with experience working iron, and Elias's calloused hands and knowing eye for metal work convinced them he was their man. "You sure you know what you're doing?" asked Samuel Morrison, the town's mayor and general store owner. He was a thin, nervous man who bore no relation to the sheriff who had driven them from Dry Hollow. "Blacksmithing's skilled work. Not everyone can pick it up." Elias ran his fingers along the edge of the anvil, testing its condition. "My father was a smith before he turned to farming, taught me the basics before I was old enough to hold the hammer properly." Another lie built on a foundation of truth. He had learned metalwork in prison, where convict labor was used to produce tools and hardware for the growing territories. Within a week, they were settled into their new life. Elias spent his days at the forge, his shirt soaked with sweat as he hammered red-hot iron into horseshoes and tools and the 1,000 small items a frontier town needed to survive. The work was hard but satisfying, each piece shaped by his skill and strength into something useful and necessary. Annalise took longer to find her place. She wandered the town in those first days, observing its rhythms and needs, searching for a way to contribute that wouldn't draw unwanted attention to their past. The answer came when she noticed how many children in Redemption Creek bore the marks of injury and illness with no one to tend them properly. Dr. Marcus Webb was a capable physician when sober, but his shaking hands and bloodshot eyes told the story of a man still fighting his demons. The town needed healing, and despite everything that had happened, Annalise still had the skills and knowledge to provide it. She started small, treating cuts and scrapes, mixing poultices for infections, sitting with fevered children through long nights. She accepted no payment beyond food and occasional supplies, presenting herself as simply a woman who had learned healing arts from her mother. "You have a gift for this, Doctor," Webb told her one afternoon as they worked together to set a child's broken arm. His hands had been steady that day, his mind clear, and together they had managed what neither could have done alone. "Where did you learn such techniques?" "My mother was skilled in the healing arts," Annalise replied carefully. It wasn't entirely false. She had learned much of what she knew from tending the sick in Dry Hollow, though she had expanded her knowledge considerably during their months in the wilderness, where every cut or fever could mean death without proper treatment. Word of her abilities spread quickly through the small community. She became known simply as Mrs. Brooks, the gentle woman who could cool a fever and calm a frightened child, who asked for nothing but gave freely of her time and knowledge. For the first time since leaving Dry Hollow, Annalise felt useful again, not as a symbol or an example, but as herself, a woman with skills and compassion to offer a community that needed both. Their evenings were quiet and simple. They would sit together on the small porch behind the blacksmith shop, watching the sun paint the canyon walls in shades of gold and crimson. Elias would tell her about the customers he had served that day, the gossip and news that filtered through the shop like water through sand. She would share stories of the families she had helped, the small victories and persistent challenges of bringing healing to a hard land. "Do you miss it?" she asked one evening as they watched stars emerge in the darkening sky. the excitement, the adventure of being on the run. Elias considered the question seriously. I miss the feeling that we could go anywhere, be anyone. But this, he gestured toward their simple home, their quiet life, the town settling into evening routines around them. This feels real in a way nothing else ever has. Even with all the pretending, the false names and made-up stories. The names don't matter. The stories we tell strangers don't matter. What matters is that we chose this life together, built it with our own hands. He reached over to take her hand, his fingers rough with calluses from the forge. Samuel and Anna Brooks might be made-up people, but the love between them is the truest thing I've ever known. She squeezed his hand, thinking about the woman she had been in Dry Hollow. Perfect, untouchable, more symbol than person. I like Anna Brooks, she said finally. She's allowed to be human. Life in Redemption Creek settled into comfortable routines. Elias's reputation as a skilled blacksmith grew, bringing customers from surrounding ranches and settlements. Annalise's healing practice expanded as well, though she was careful to maintain the fiction that she was simply a housewife with a talent for nursing. They made friends cautiously. The sheriff, Tom Bradley, who appreciated Elias's quiet competence and asked no questions about his past. Mary Chen, who ran the general store with her Chinese husband and understood something about starting over in a place where you didn't quite belong. Father Miguel Santos, the young Catholic priest who had come west to minister to the Mexican families in the area and stayed to serve a congregation that included former Protestants, lapsed Catholics, and people who had given up on organized religion entirely but still needed someone to listen. You have peace in your home, Father Santos observed one evening when he had come to treat a burn on Elias's arm, an occupational hazard of blacksmith work. It is a rare thing, that kind of contentment. Annalise looked up from cleaning the wound. We're grateful for what we have. Gratitude is a gift. The priest agreed. But this is more than that. You have found something many people search for their entire lives without success. He was right, she realized. Despite everything they had lost, everything they had endured, she and Elias had found something that most people never experienced. A love that had been tested by fire and emerged stronger. A partnership built on choice rather than obligation. A life that belonged entirely to them. But peace, they were learning, was a fragile thing. The stranger arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, riding a dust-covered horse and wearing the kind of clothes that marked him as someone with money and authority. He tied his mount outside the general store and spent an hour talking quietly with Mary Chen, showing her a piece of paper that made her face go pale. By evening, word had spread through the small community. Someone was asking questions about a couple matching their description. Someone with connections to the law and the resources to make trouble for anyone who got in his way. Elias found Annalise in their kitchen, staring out the window at the canyon walls that had seemed like protection but now felt like a trap. We could run again, he said quietly, coming to stand behind her. I'm tired of running. Her voice was steady, but he could hear the exhaustion underneath. I'm tired of looking over our shoulder, tired of wondering when the past will catch up with us. Then what do you want to do? She turned to face him, her blue eyes bright with determination. I want to fight. I want to tell our story, the real story, and let people decide for themselves whether we deserve the life we've built here. Elias felt a chill of fear at her words. Annalise, if they find out who we really are. Anna, she corrected gently. I'm Anna Brooks now, remember? And Anna Brooks isn't afraid to stand up for herself and the man she loves. He looked at her, this woman who had grown from a sheltered preacher's daughter into someone capable of shooting a man to protect what she valued. Someone who could heal a child's fever or deliver a difficult birth. Someone who had chosen love over safety and never once looked back. Then we face it together, he said, pulling her into his arms. Whatever comes, we face it together. Outside their window, the desert night settled over Redemption Creek like a blanket. Tomorrow would bring whatever challenges the stranger's questions had set in motion. But tonight, they held each other and planned not for escape, but for the fight that would determine whether they could keep the life they had built from nothing but love and determination. The time for hiding was over. The time for truth had come. The decision came easier than either of them had expected. The stranger, a territorial marshal named Jacob Hartwell, had spent 3 days in Redemption Creek, asking careful questions and showing faded photographs to anyone who would look. He was methodical and patient, the kind of lawman who understood that rushing led to mistakes, and mistakes let guilty parties slip through the net. But Redemption Creek had closed ranks around the couple they knew as Samuel and Anna Brooks. Mary Chen claimed she couldn't make out the faces in the photographs clearly enough to be certain. Dr. Webb, sober for once and sharp as a razor, suggested that many people looked alike from a distance and that the marshal might be chasing shadows. Even Father Santos, when pressed, admitted that he saw dozens of couples pass through his territory and couldn't be expected to remember them all. On Thursday morning, Elias and Annalise made their choice. They would be married, properly, publicly, with the whole town as witness, not as fugitives hiding behind false names, but as the people they had become, Samuel and Anna Brooks, who had earned their place in this community through honest work and genuine care for their neighbors. "You're certain about this?" Father Santos asked as they sat in his small church, discussing the arrangements. "Marriage is a sacred bond, not to be entered into lightly. We've been married in every way that matters for over a year," Anna replied, her hand resting easily in Samuel's. "This is just making it official." The priest studied their faces, the quiet strength in Samuel's expression, the calm determination in Anna's eyes. He had counseled many couples preparing for marriage, and he recognized something rare in these two. They had already been tested by hardship and emerged stronger for it. "Very well," he said. "Saturday afternoon. Then I'll announce the banns at Sunday service, though I suspect the whole town already knows." Word spread quickly through Redemption Creek. A wedding was cause for celebration in any frontier community, but this one carried special significance. The couple who had quickly become central to the town's life were making their commitment public, declaring their intention to stay and build their future here. The preparations were simple but heartfelt. Mary Chen offered to make the wedding dress, working with fabric she had been saving for something special. The other women of the community took charge of the reception, planning a modest feast in the church courtyard. The men, led by Sheriff Bradley, insisted on providing music and entertainment for the evening's festivities. Marshal Hartwell watched it all with the patient interest of a cat studying a mouse hole. He had no concrete evidence that these were the people he sought. Elias Boone and Annalise Whitlow, wanted for questioning in the death of Mayor Vernon Blake. But his instincts, honed by 20 years of law enforcement, told him he was close to his quarry. On Saturday afternoon, as the desert sun painted the canyon walls in shades of gold and amber, the entire population of Redemption Creek gathered in and around the small church. Anna wore a simple white dress that transformed her into something radiant, her golden hair crowned with wildflowers picked from the canyon meadows. Samuel stood beside her in his best shirt and carefully pressed trousers, his scarred face peaceful as he watched his bride approach the altar. Father Santos conducted the ceremony with dignity and warmth, his words carrying clearly in the desert air. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Samuel Brooks and Anna Brooks, two souls who have found in each other the completion of their earthly journey. The vows they spoke were traditional, but the emotion behind them was anything but conventional. These were two people who had chosen each other repeatedly, in scandal and exile, in hardship and danger, in the quiet moments of building a life together. When Samuel slipped the simple gold band onto Anna's finger, his voice was steady as stone. With this ring, I thee wed. With my body, I thee worship. With all my worldly goods, I thee endow. Anna's response carried the same quiet strength. I take you as my lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part. When Father Santos pronounced them husband and wife, The kiss they shared was gentle and reverent, a public declaration of a love that had already weathered more storms than most couples faced in a lifetime. The celebration that followed was everything a frontier wedding should be, filled with music and laughter, good food and heartfelt toasts. The townspeople had embraced the couple as their own, and the joy was genuine and infectious. Marshall Hartwell stood at the edge of the celebration, nursing a glass of whiskey and watching the proceedings with professional interest. As the evening wore on and the dancing grew livelier, he approached the happy couple. "Congratulations," he said formally. "It's always good to see folks finding happiness in this hard country." "Thank you, Marshall," Samuel replied, his arm protective around his wife's waist. "We appreciate your kind words." "Funny thing, though," Hartwell continued, his tone conversational but his eyes sharp. "You remind me of some folks I've been looking for, couple named Boone and Whitlow, wanted for questioning back east." The music seemed to falter for a moment, conversations pausing as nearby guests picked up on the tension. Anna felt Samuel's muscles tense beneath her hand, but his expression remained calm. "Can't say I know those names, Marshall," Samuel said evenly. "But then, lots of folks out here are running from something. Question is whether they're running towards something better." Hartwell smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Indeed. And what would you say you're running toward, Mr. Brooks?" Anna stepped slightly forward, her chin lifting with quiet dignity. "A life we can be proud of, Marshall. An honest day's work, a community that needs us, a love that makes us better people than we were alone." The Marshal studied her face in the lamplight, noting the calm certainty in her voice, the way the townspeople had unconsciously moved closer as if to shield their own from outside interference. "That's a fine thing to run toward," he said finally. "I hope you find what you're looking for." He tipped his hat to the couple and melted back into the crowd. But his message was clear. He knew who they were, but he was choosing not to act on that knowledge. Perhaps because a year of investigation had revealed the true nature of Vernon Blake's character. Perhaps because he recognized something in their story that spoke to his own understanding of justice. Or perhaps because he could see what everyone in Redemption Creek could see, that these two had found something rare and precious, and destroying it would serve no purpose beyond satisfying the letter of a law that had already been bent beyond recognition. A week later, Marshall Hartwell rode out of town. His investigation officially concluded with no suspects located. His report would note that the trail had gone cold in the desert, that the fugitives had likely perished in the wilderness or moved on to California or Mexico, where they would be beyond territorial jurisdiction. The letter arrived a month later, brought by a traveling merchant who had passed through what remained of Dry Hollow. It was addressed to Anna Brooks, though the merchant had been told it was for someone who might or might not exist in Redemption Creek. Anna opened it with trembling hands, recognizing the careful script despite the shakiness that spoke of age and infirmity. "My dear daughter," it began, and she had to stop reading for a moment to compose herself. "I am told you may never see these words, but I write them anyway, hoping they will somehow reach you. I am dying. Annalise, the doctors say it is my heart, though I know it is really the weight of my pride and stubbornness that is killing me. I was wrong. About everything. About you. About the choices I forced upon you. About the man you chose to love. The truth about Vernon Blake came out after you left. His debts. His violence toward women who could not defend themselves. His corruption of everything he touched. The church is gone now, burned not by angry townspeople but by my own guilt and shame. I drove out an angel to protect a devil, and I have lived with that knowledge every day since. If you are alive, if you are happy, if you have found the love and peace that I denied you, then praise God for His mercy where I showed none. I do not ask for forgiveness, for I know I do not deserve it. I ask only that you know that my last thoughts will be of you, and that despite everything I did wrong, I always loved you. I pray that somewhere in this wide world, you have found the happiness that I was too blind to see you deserved. Your father, in love and sorrow, Jonathan Whitlow." She wept then, for the father who had loved her imperfectly, for the years they had lost, for the forgiveness that came too late to heal the wounds between them. Samuel held her as she cried, understanding without words the complex grief of mourning someone who had both cherished and betrayed her. 2 days later, they made the journey back to the place that had been their beginning, not to Dry Hollow, which had withered and died after the scandal, but to the burned remains of the Blackthorn Ranch where they had first found each other. The ruins were being reclaimed by the desert, but in the shadow of what had once been a barn, a single mesquite tree had taken root. Its branches were still small, its shade modest, but it was growing, reaching toward the sky with quiet determination. Anna placed a single wildflower at the base of the tree, not for her father, who lay buried in the cemetery of a dead town, but for the woman she had been, the angel who had died so that Anna Brooks could be born. "Thank you," she whispered to the desert wind, to the memories, to the strange providence that had brought them through fire to this moment of peace. Samuel took her hand as they walked back toward their horses, back toward their life in Redemption Creek, back toward a future they would write together with steady hands and hearts full of hard-won wisdom. Behind them, the little tree continued its patient growth, a testament to the truth that even in the harshest ground, love could take root and flourish. And somewhere in the desert silence, the wind carried the sound of their laughter as they rode toward home. Two souls who had found in each other the redemption their new town had promised. Their story would become legend in time. The angel and the outlaw who had defied society to love on their own terms. But for now, they were simply Samuel and Anna Brooks, heading home to their forge and their healing practice, to the community that had embraced them, to the life they had built from nothing but courage and devotion. The desert stretched endlessly around them, vast and unforgiving, but no longer hostile. They had learned its secrets, earned their place in its fierce embrace. And as the sun set behind them, painting the sky in shades of promise, they rode into tomorrow together, unafraid at last. Thank you for listening to this tale of love, redemption, and the courage to choose one's own path in the unforgiving wilderness of the American West. If this story has touched your heart, please let us know in the comments where you're listening from. We love connecting with fellow travelers around the campfire of storytelling. Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more tales of love and adventure from the frontier. And share your thoughts about Samuel and Anna's journey. Until we meet again under the desert stars, may your own path lead to the love and freedom you seek.